Yeah, if you're on the Zoom, can you turn your speaker off? If you're in the council chamber.
That's this one here that's picking up all of the voices.
I think when you want to speak, you probably have to hit that.
That one go off.
It's on.
Can you just mute them?
There we go.
There we go.
Lovely.
Yeah, okay.
Oh look, see myself. Pensive.
Good morning.
Greg makes an accounting joke.
Is my mic's on for the people on Zoom? Nope, Zoom's gone. Okay. Good morning, Mayor and Councillors. This briefing today is the second DC briefing. And this is about, just as a reminder, the first briefing I made a bit of an introduction about DCs. Some councillors who starting out strongly here, new term councillors have not had much discussion about development contributions, so that was to introduce and just give some basics. This second briefing is us as staff seeking some stronger direction to go ahead and undertake some modelling, DC modelling, to analyse options that the elected members wish us to pursue, to update the development community as to this briefing and just any certainty or expectations we can give them, and for us to go away and do some estimates of financial impacts. Just before I start, I'm sure that the councillors are aware, but the council is subject to a judicial review of its development contributions policy. That was received only late last week, so I won't say anything about that at this meeting, but there will be a PX briefing coming soon where we'll discuss that matter. Now, my slides, just up to slide 3, please. So just one back, please. Very high level context. The purpose of a DC policy in the legislation is to recover fair and equitable and proportionate portion of the total cost of CapEx necessary to service growth over the long term. So I think the main thing there is just to understand that it's a very long-term model that looks 30, 40 years out and 10 to 15 years back. So that's the context you have for your recovery. Next slide is timeline to adoption. You'll see on the far left we're at the 2nd of September at this briefing, and we're moving through the options analysis and high-level drafting, and to the 22nd of October is the next touch point, where there'll be an update there, and then moving through all the way through to next year, early next year, with the full-blown policy analysis and the budget in the middle of that, where our DC revenue forecasts will feed into the council budgets. Next slide, please. This is just an illustration of council's DC revenue over the last 10 or so years. As you can see, since the introduction of the 2018 policy, council's DC revenue has been sitting at 20 to 25 million and up to 30 million, and prior to that significantly less, but I guess this just shows too that the development contributions revenue is a significant contribution to council's revenue stream, and in particular it relates to funding infrastructure. So decisions made in the policy that have the effect of reducing revenue or not, have a consequential effect on our financial strategy and ability to raise debt.
Just a question on that, if I can. I assume, Paula, you're chairing.
No, am I? I wasn't. These things tend to run themselves, but I can.
Can I a quick question, Chair?
Yes, you can.
Just on that, Greg, I didn't see a key for the other pictures. Like, what are the other quantums in the graphs?
Oh, they're quarters. Quarter 1, quarter 2, quarter 3, quarter 4.
Okay. Thank you.
Next slide. So now I just move into the policy options. There are sort of two categories of options. One of them is around, do you want to subsidise or cap charges or partly subsidise charges for strategic reasons to incentivise development, etc. And the second category are around the provisions themselves. So what do you want to do differently in the policy? And this first one is an example of that, and Stafford's going to talk us through the community infrastructure option.
Okay, so the current government has changed its legislation, so we can now collect development contributions for community infrastructure again. So this is the first major policy review since then. So it's really the first opportunity to put them back in if you so desired. So just a bit of a background that parks and playgrounds are currently collected for under the reserves category. So a large portion of what someone might determine as community facilities are already collected under a different category here. So it's other types of assets that we could collect for, such as H3 sort of stadia, or your libraries and your other assets like pools. So they're not the largest portion of capital expenditure that we currently incur. So that's one thing to consider. So it is consistent to collect for them because they are growth assets, but on the other hand, something else to consider is that if you think that DCs are significantly high already and you were considering to mitigate the level of the DCs, then this would do the opposite. It would add cost in to every charge. So they kind of go in the opposite direction if you wanted to make that strategic move.
But the issue is, sorry, are we on? The issue is community value, value of the property, isn't it? That your property is going to be a lot more valuable if you've got a park coming up next door and a playground just down the road, right?
So development contributions can collect for assets that
are to be built.
That are in the schedule.
Yeah.
So if you decide to put them in, it will be built. It's, there's a link between, there's definitely a link between if there's funding for this type of asset, can we afford to put it in to the schedule? But in terms of the funding you can always choose to put something in that you determine to be important and fund it through a general rate per se. Also, because the horizon of collection is over such a long period, as Greg was alluding, these models look back into the past 15 years and go 30 years into the future. It doesn't necessarily alleviate a burden on sort of some financial constraints that you have today. If you're up against your debt headroom issue, you can't go ahead and put in a really expensive asset and then just earmark it as paid for by DCs, because you're still going to incur the debt in the short term until it's collected over a 30-year period. So there is definitely a link between the two, though, that if it's funded, you can provide more of them. Another thing to consider is that due to the open access nature of these assets, it's generally a low percentage of the total cost of the asset that can be collected through development contributions. So one of the historic examples is the Claudelands Arena. About 5% of that total project was going to be collected for by DCs. So very large projects like that might have a small percentage and still be a meaningful sum of development contributions. And new assets in a growth cell will have a larger percentage, such as a new library. If a new library was to go into Peacock or somewhere like that, for instance, that could collect a far larger than a 5%, but they have citywide network benefits as well, and existing residents can use them. And also these assets are used by people from outside of the city, so there's a percentage that we just can't collect for at all. So there's these competing sides to the coin there, to be, yes, we should potentially collect for all growth assets to be consistent, but they'll push up the charges as one consideration, and they can be quite difficult to collect for not as larger portion of money as other assets like roads, for example.
How subjective then is the 5% calculation? So you used 5% on Claudelands. Why couldn't it be 10%?
So that one,
I'm just using that as an example to say,
Yeah.
Obviously the calculation has got the 5% in it, but why can't it be 10% or 20%?
what you need to have really is a reasonable and justifiable way of working that out. That one actually, Claudelands, was just, the council was only recovering the arena and not the rest of Claudelands, and I'm not 100% sure why. That was back in the day. So a reasonable method for, say, a library is just a proportion of population. So how many more people are going to go into that cell versus how many people are there in the city, that type of thing. So you can influence the cost allocation, but they're always up for challenge, so it has to be a sensible and justifiable amount. The Claudelands one is particularly low. You'll be looking at significantly higher for a library that you actively determined to put in, and it would provide funding. Yep.
So just as an example, thinking of Peacock and maybe a library, and a library may not be needed for the next 10 years, but it might be needed in, say, year 15. Are we constrained in terms of the DC calculation to what is in the 10-year plan, or can we go further than the 10 years and say, well, in year 15 at Peacock, that might be the appropriate time given the size of the cell in terms of residents to put a library in. So can we do that and include the cost of that library in as a DC for the Peacock section sales?
So the local government explicitly says that you can go beyond the 10-year period, and that was put in about 2014. So you can, but then you still have to have the same test around, causation or exacerbator. So like we recover our stormwater swale future asset because ultimately everyone in the growth cell is going to benefit from that, irrespective if it's born 15 years in the future. So you'd have to make a similar assessment about a library. I mean, you could say, yep, ultimately everyone's going to benefit from the Peacock's library, but if it's going to be built in 15 years' time, you still have to answer the question of, well, I'm paying a DC today of $3,000 on my house or something, whatever the number is. Is that actually reasonable, given that the thing isn't going to be there for 15 years? So, there are some tests there that you need to pass, and I guess ultimately that's a decision for the council. Is that reasonable, based on legal advice and the analysis?
So what you're saying is the DC on the library at Peacock might be quite a bit less for somebody moving in now than what it might be in the calculation and somebody moving in year 12 and buying a section when the library is maybe only 3 years away.
No, it's the charge is set across all years. So you more make the decision of whether you start charging or not, rather than you don't incrementally change the charges based on years. That's the typical method.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just in following up from that, if I may, this whole thing that the Property Council refers to as causal nexus, which is at the heart of what you're talking about here, isn't it? We've been told I'm not going to go into their challenge on anything, but we've been told that it's quite complicated to understand the cause and effect there. So but the staff have told us that they've done their very, very best to kind of take a fair lens across the lifetime of the assets that they're funding through development. Do you think, given that what Rob's saying, do you think we have got the balance absolutely right? That's one question. Your team is confident that we have really looked at this inside and out and pitched the contribution fairly on all parties?
We've certainly looked at it long and hard, and transport, water, wastewater, stormwater is based on technical engineering information, transport modelling. We also have an economic advisor, plus the experience and the team and legal. So there is a lot of focus put on it. It is complicated, partly because such a spotlight's been put on it. You need to really articulate your justifications, and the more you go into something, the more complex it becomes. So I agree with them that it is complex. Am I satisfied? I am satisfied that we have put a lot of work on, and I don't have a vested interest when we're doing that as to the level of allocation. I mean, we'll just do the work and come up with a recommendation and compare it to other councils and the law. So, in fact, in none of this do we try and get more DCs. So I think, my view is, it's been our best effort to have a fair answer, and I think we can defend it. I'm happy to defend those allocations.
That's cool. The other, I'm not sure if you are the right people to answer it, but just to flag it as a question that I wouldn't mind answered through the process, is other mechanisms of sharing across the lifetime of some assets, the cost, and what Rob was talking about, the critical timing. We don't choose targeted rates very much as an organisation yet. We use some, and some that we did use we took off, like the Hamilton Gardens was originally a targeted rate, now it's part of the general rate. But is there a place for further consideration of that as we go forward, in terms of if a community has a planned playground, just for argument's sake, or because we're talking about the community assets, in year 5, but clearly they're disgruntled and they want it there when they move in, to target rates more smartly. So, okay, look, we can afford to put this in, and we think it's fair to put this in here, but you clearly want bigger or better or earlier. A targeted rate's another possibility, and can, apart from the development contributions, can targeted rates or agreements also be applied to developers in terms of lining up?
So the first answer is absolutely. Targeted rate is an option, and it's quite an effective tool. Certain things are more suited to one thing or the other, but say if you had an asset like a pool or a playground and you wanted to set a targeted rate in order to recover that because you felt that DCs was doing something that didn't feel was appropriate. I mean, the challenge is always identifying the area, because ultimately you have to draw a line between who's paying a targeted rate and who's not. And if it's a playground, it's like, well, that guy can still use it. And so there's always challenges around the specifics of it. But the short answer is, a targeted rate is a good tool. It's quite flexible. It also needs to be reset every year, where a development contributions policy has a longer life than that. And you can fund a certain asset through a targeted rate and not in your DC policy, and have them both going at once. And targeted rates are more flexible in terms of timing. So it's absolutely as part of a package of how you fund infrastructure. And that's my team. I mean, we are growth funding. So, we would look at and implement, whether it's IFF funding, targeted rates, DCs, et cetera, et cetera. So it's in our basket. So if you would like us to look at that in certain circumstances.
And look, senior leadership team are aware that targeted all forms of financing, what we've got to do going forward, on the table as far as I'm concerned for the LTP, and having some greater understanding about when and how we might apply a targeted rate that is equitable and makes sense would be of interest to me, because it might mean that we can bring some work forward from our plan that people have, quite rightly saying we've been waiting, or it could be that we can front foot funding some stuff. So
Are you referring to, say...
I was talking about the community assets in particular.
In Rototuna, perhaps?
Yeah, Rototuna. We certainly don't want to make that same mistake with Peacock. I don't think we will.
Yeah.
But, hindsight's a wonderful thing. But we've got retrofitting the city in parts too, and if we do everything that people aspire to, it's huge. So we've just got to think more carefully about how we fund things. The other thing about the causal nexus that interests me is that the effect. So developers might say, well, we're not responsible for playgrounds or swales or back corridors or anything else, right, that we might think of in this area. That's council's work. We build the houses. We want to build houses as cheaply as possible, and the more you keep asking us to think about this and this and this, the more difficult it becomes. Having said that, if those areas remained in their current state, there wouldn't be the need for that work, right? So, like in Peacock, the back corridor, that we're negotiating with DOC. If the area stayed in green fields at the moment, then that wouldn't be an issue. So it's who drives what and finding that balance. I find that difficult to.
I think it comes
to
back to
see
your
how it
financial strategy too. Like, you know, the strategy is principally growth pays for growth. You know, the council obviously can choose to you know, dial that back or keep that where it is. But I think the way to look at it probably is that the DC development contributions regime allows you to recover infrastructure costs for ding, 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 all these things. And then the council can choose whether or not to do it. And under the current DC policy, where costs can be recovered, they are. Is that, you know, matching with the growth pays for growth philosophy?
So at the end of this exercise, I'd like to just flag that when we talk about growth pays for growth, that we could have some common understanding around governance, and everyone else really for that matter, about what that actually is defined as. Because does it mean it's including some of these aspects, or does it not? We've kind of always gone around and said growth will pay for growth. And I bet you if you went around the room right now and asked all of us what we interpret that to mean, you'd get a slightly different perspective on that. And I think we sort of need to move, my personal view is we maybe need to move forward to a set understanding of what that actually is. Because then we can talk with the developers quite directly and say, well, you know, no, we see you as having to contribute to this and we'll contribute to that. And I don't think I have something ready to, when, you know, if I were to ask at a forum tomorrow, what do you mean? I can talk about water and roads and things like that, but there's some other areas we haven't quite landed, isn't it? So I'm hoping this is what you're hoping to achieve from this, is get some.
Oh, absolutely, yep. And I'll have a chat to David Bryant, because that sits in the financial policy as well, and
It's very lofty, and I just want to bring it down to what it really means.
yeah, and it doesn't mean 100. I mean, DCs can only recover. DCs only recover, I think, 60% of the total cost of all the growth infrastructure. So, you know, it's more to the extent that, you know, council can, it will, you know, as far as DCs go, and then as far as David's, you know, all his financial strategies, that probably needs to be added to the interpretation of DCs and growth pays for growth.
Perfect. I think Margaret's got a question. Margaret, do you have a question?
How much input has the development or the developers community had at the front end of this policy? You're saying that, you know, we've got a team of experts and we're experienced and we're using our lawyers and our staff, etc., and we've come up with this policy that we think is fair, but I want to know how much input and how much of the conversation has included developers.
Yeah, sure. So this is the front end of the process, so we haven't developed any new provisions, we haven't, there are no decisions made. So, and I have been consulting with the development community, well, in particular the Property Council and several key stakeholders, and the intention of that, my intention and their desire are the same, that the development community has the most certainty and the most upfront understanding of where the process is heading, and also opportunity to provide input. So that's the intention, and when we've focused on that, there's a more focus on that this year, because I think in the last policy review, developers felt like they didn't have time, or that their input wasn't understood early enough. And that's sort of a product of the process, is that we develop our policy, we have a draft in December, and then we go away for Christmas, and then we come back and we have public consultation where, you know, they are exposed to the draft policy, and then they have submissions, and then by the time the submissions are read for something complex public policy like DC policy, you get close to deliberations, or you get into deliberations, and you know the policy has progressed quite far. So what I'm trying to do this year is, to the extent that I can, is get early indications, early feedback, as well as just provide certainty, you know, what's happening, you know, how, you know, what have the councillors indicated as preferences, just things like that so that they can have a better chance at knowing what's coming.
Look, I appreciate your answer, but I don't, that's not the understanding I get from your answer. It sounds to me, and given what we're currently facing with our DC, well, is it the current one or the historic DC policy that all fusses about at the moment?
So I think we need to cover off that particular judicial review matters in a PX briefing, but yeah, I'd rather not dig into that right now. That'll be coming soon.
I don't want to go there. All I'm trying to figure out is, well, we've got a whole lot of developers that are saying, we don't agree with what's gone on. So I'm just trying to avoid a similar situation. And you're saying that you've talked to the Property Council and a couple of others. Well, to me, that's not really the full spectrum of developers. I could name them, given the report that we've been sent this morning. So, to me, the red flag is, well, when do we include all of the developers, or as many as we can? Let's open it up. And you're telling me we don't actually include them until we've come up with a draft, and then we take it to them. Well, to me, that's sort of around the other way. You actually want to get them on board first, get them around the table first, and we have done that in the past. So, an answer to my question is, if I interpret what you're saying, is that staff have come up with a draft, spoken to Property Council and a couple of others, and then we're going to put it out to for consultation.
So we haven't come up with a draft, and we're in the early stages. So we haven't got to that point yet. But if we did, that would be an unsuccessful effort at pre-engagement. There is no direction. This is what this meeting is about: is getting an initial steer on where the elected members would like to head, so that we can go away and do some work. And I'll be happy to advise the the developers that that's what the direction is, and that's what we're going away to do. There's no problem there.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. So, therefore, I would suggest, and it's only a suggestion, if elected members think there's some merit in it, that we, as we're developing a draft, that we include as many developers around the table as we can.
Yeah, no, it's good.
Right
It's good.
early on, rather than a long, drawn-out process and chopping and changing things after the fact. Thanks.
Absolutely. Now, are we back in? Okay, so I'll keep going. There's no other questions. Okay, good. Next slide, please. That's okay. So the next slide and the next category of options for the elected members is something we've talked about a number of times, and now looking for some indications of what to go ahead with, and it's about capping DC charges. So through the mayor's question.
Sorry, Greg, isn't that the same slide that we just were looking at?
Oh yeah, it should be the next slide.
Thank you.
Yeah, so the mayor's touched on this. You know, what does growth pays for growth actually mean in the context of, in this case, DC policy? So under the way the DC policy basically works is it has a structure and a regime and a set of tests and things that the council needs to meet, and that is the maximum charge that you can charge. And then, on reflection, under Section 101 of the Local Government Act, the council is directed to consider the impact on the community of the allocation of liability ... which effectively means, is the DC too high for reasons that we've determined relating to the community. And so this is code for, do you want to cap your charges or any of your charges, reduce them, subsidise certain developments, all those things kind of mean the same thing. And I guess just one point is it won't cause DCs in other areas to increase. So simple case is that you're trading, or the trade-off is development revenue, so revenue from developers, or rates. So that's certainly obviously an important thing to think about, that caps will increase the rates impact. Now in the past, council has done this in the past. So between 2013 and 2018, non-residential development was capped, and the CBD and residential intensification zones. So it had, next slide please. The current policy has only minimal caps in Rauta Kāore, and it has the CBD remission, which everyone's familiar with. And then from a strategic perspective, I would encourage the use of caps to complement other council plans and initiatives. And there you can also take a view towards encouraging economic activity. So, like if you, for example, and I'll actually move on to the next slide, I think is where I talk about it, and incentivise infill. So, you know, whether it from the government or, and I know the elected members have preference to look at more intensification or better intensification as an alternative to greenfield. So the DC policy is an option to try and incentivise infill, and I think I would recommend, you know, using the DC policy through the district plan provisions and understanding the priorities of the elected members to try and create, if you want to do that, to create incentives by having lower DCs, and you can do it largely through the area. You can say this area will pay, will have a capped or a lower DC, a type of development, so it could be attached house or a detached house. You can have sectors, so we want to subsidise or incentivise commercial or industrial, or just general residential, or you could do it by zoning. But the best way is to have it pegged to the district plan, because when the DC assessment team get applications in, you want some proper structure and some defined areas that sit behind it in order to, you know, A, make it more robust, and B, make it clear to developers. The wafflier you have things in the policy, the more you know, criticism you'll get, and the more time you'll spend effectively debating whether or not, you know, these things meet a definition.
Just a really quick question. How easy is it to actually do that? I mean, are we talking district plan adjustments, all that kind of stuff, out to public appeals, etc.? Like if we decided, right, we'll decide as a collective we want to concentrate on accommodation infill in the city, for example. How long is that process to change? Because obviously we've got to give developers plenty of time. How easy is it for us to change? How nimble are we really?
So, I mean, you wouldn't change the district plan just to affect the DC policy. So I think you would use the district plan to find a way to create the incentives you want within those parameters.
Yep.
And we know the MPSUD is coming through, but that's going to be several years away. So you'd be looking at your operative district plan.
Yep.
The hard bit is deciding what it is, the incentives you want, and analysing it and justifying it and all the rest of it. In terms of the actual DC policy, write a provision, change some parameters in the model, no problems. So it's really the decision making and not the technical side of it so much, because you're allowed to do it, you know, by right. So yeah.
So it's quite quick if you need to be.
If you get
Okay.
and
Thanks,
reach a
Greg.
decision. That's right.
Questions from Sarah and then Ewan.
Thank you, Paula. I almost forgot my question, but it's come back. One was just around looking at density. Does it work that we look at the likely yield of an area and then set the DCs depending on what we think the density is going to be? And so is that how it works?
No, because you need to set a DC policy which may exist for up to 3 years. So the way that we, and this has been done in the past, is the residential intensification zones, which attract a significant amount of the high density development is to incentivise development in that area and say that it must be an attached dwelling to get a discount, which would achieve the same thing, but it would have that structure behind it.
Sorry, I'm just not fully clear. So say, for example, we've set the DCs for Peacock, and then we say in the structure plan, actually we want to have, an extra 2,000 dwellings because through our district plan we allow greater density or, encourage it or whatever it may be. Then how does it impact on the DCs? Do we end up then getting more DCs from that, or do we reduce the overall DCs to accommodate that, since you're having, you have more dwellings, so you're going to have more infrastructure costs, but probably, I imagine that you would, per dwelling infrastructure cost would still be a bit lower with more dwellings.
That's right. And the way that it would happen is when you update your policy, you will have a higher, number of Hueys in that growth cell, and the charge will drop.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. And so that, and you need to do that in order to stay consistent with the, with legislation around DCs, I presume.
Yeah, there's a certain amount of flexibility. So you can continue to run a policy, while the world changes, because just administratively, it's not practical to update your DC policy every time each thing happens. But over the years, certainly over the last 6 or 7 years, we've been quite willing, and we have done annual reviews at appropriate times, and where there's more certainty over a longer period of time, the policy stayed intact, and that's an elected member decision, so you can review your policy at any time.
Right. Okay. All right. I think that makes sense. Thanks, Greg.
Yeah, thanks, Mayor Paula. First, Greg, thanks for all the good work you do in this area. We currently have a remission policy for encouraging CBD intensification. Can you remind us how useful that's been and how well it's worked? And any suggestions of fine-tuning to encourage what we could do to even incentivise that more with changing some of the parameters?
Sure. 3 slides, I've got that exact slide.
Oh.
So I'll
happily wait patiently. Yeah, cool, no problem.
And I did just want to add one thing about the infill. So I've been discussing this with the city planning team and around the incentivising infill, is to consider in the policy that you're eligible for a remission, but only if you enter into the urban design process, the urban design panel. So this isn't an approval type thing. We're not suggesting, or the suggestion is not that you have to get approved or you have to meet the conditions, but simply just to take advantage of that we're going to provide a remission, and that will then push more people into that that urban design panel process. So that's something I think positive and almost no cost.
Margaret has a question also. Sorry,
Yes.
I don't always see your blue hand, so.
Thank you, Greg. How do we, and thank you, Paula, how do we make the urban design panel process compulsory? At the moment it's voluntary, isn't it?
Well, it would just be a requirement, and this is just a suggestion, so we're just trying to think of ways to achieve some of the aims the councillors have, but it would just be that if you would have needed to go, you just need to, in order to get the remission, you enter the process. So that's, how would we make it compulsory? I think it's only compulsory if you want the remission that's available.
We've had some discussion at council level, but I think the effect that the urban design panel is having, or has potential to have, is not as good as it should be. In other words, I think there's still some design and building going on that's not really meeting the mark. And not just for written purposes, but how can we update the urban design panel, but also make the process compulsory for anyone that's building houses, big developments, to go through that part of the system, through the design panel as part of the system. I mean, I've seen places overseas where you have to paint in certain colours, and that might very well be a part of their district plan, but if there's more oversight and there's more ability for us to tighten and enhance through that urban design panel, because design is everything, poor design is absolutely shocking for all the reasons that we know of, but if we get it right, man, you know, this city and its architecture and design, and we're not actually greatly known for it, could go to the next level.
Unfortunately, I can't answer
So the
that.
question is, how do we include that design panel in our process, our consenting process?
Yeah, so unfortunately, I can't answer that, and that's the city planning guidance unit matter. So I won't try. But this DC proposal is simply to push more volume in there, or some more volume. I know that I'm not trying to dodge the question. I actually don't know the answer to how to reform the urban design panel, but it wouldn't be my call. But I think Luke O'Dwyer owns that space. I can see why it's an important question. I'm not the one to answer it.
Okay, well, I only asked it because you had it there on the slide, but I appreciate it.
I think Dave said a question. I think he did. Did you? Jeff has? Okay. I thought I saw Dave waving, but maybe not. So, Jeff.
Oh, look, I'm happy just to keep the presentation going, and I'll come at the end maybe.
If you've got any questions, feel free. We'll get round up some commentary towards it as well.
Okay, it was just perhaps nailing down the timing of possible changes to the current district plan. You know, if we were to make changes to the remission process and trying to encourage, say, apartments in the central city, I was just trying to get a feel for what sort of time frame that could be applied. Is that something that could be done within a 12-month period? That sort of change.
So I think this is the good direction that we'd need to go away and do the good work on to understand that exactly. But I think broadly speaking in the CBD, the restrictions are off, as I understand it. And then in terms of height and other things, so there's quite a lot of flexibility. And then you could go into your DC policy and try and find ways to incentivise the right types of development that the council wants. So that's all well within the scope, and there will be limits. Some things are just better ideas and worse ideas. So that's, I think, today is and I'm taking that as feedback to direction to go away and investigate effective development incentives in the CBD.
Yeah, and ones that don't take 3 or 4 years to develop, I guess. Something, because it's obviously going to be a lag when you introduce something before things happen anyway. So I guess I'm hoping for some nimbleness and agility in terms of the timing for how we, once we've made a decision for how we can introduce these things.
So the CBD, so this would happen, with your policy adoption, if you chose, with your policy adoption at 30 June. So there are ways we can find to provide those incentives. Things where your district plan matters and where there might be need to wait until amendments come through is, say, like PT transport nodes and wanting to encourage, development around public transport hubs, because if you don't have those areas defined in the district plan, it's more challenging to do that through a DC policy. So when you get sort of those metro spatial plan type provisions and density coming on in a couple of years, then it's easier to direct your incentives through a DC policy. But it's not to say there aren't a number of things that we can do in this upcoming policy to get the ball rolling.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Greg. Thanks, Paula.
Dave, did you have a question or no? No? No, okay. I'm assuming not.
Okay, we'll jump to the next one, which is continue the the CBD remission. So quick background, we have an automatic 66% off or 66% reduction, which ends or is up for review with this long-term plan. There is evidence that the CBD remission does encourage development, which I'll mention in the next slide. And I guess there's an option for the council, obvious. Does it want to be increased, decreased, or removed, or made 100%? You know, all these things are easily possible. And then, as I said, this is not complex from a modelling perspective. It's just a switch. It's a decision. It is offset by rates, and it's consistent with our vibrant CBD approach and the city central city transformation plan. If you go to the next slide, please, with the two graphs. This is a snapshot of, it's probably a couple on from that. It's got two graphs on it. Yep, that's it. Is there an evidence base for the CBD remission? There is. There's an evidence base in the level of development and in developer comments. So this has been in place since 2013, and obviously developers, particularly obviously CBD developers, are going to be in favour. But actually over time, as I've talked to more and more people, if you talk to the development consultants and people in the industry, I mean, people are attracted to making decisions to investigate or go in the CBD because of the remission, and otherwise they're looking somewhere else. So I think there is a real connection, that just the attractiveness, if you have $1 million DC for a hotel, argument's sake, and suddenly that's 333,000, and those are upfront costs in there, leading up to their design and their initial findings. So from a business case perspective, yes, it does make a difference. And in these graphs here, there's not a direct correlation, obviously. You don't know for sure that all of these developments happen because of the remission, but I mean, there's a pretty strong correlation, and you can see in 2013 on the blue that there was effectively nothing in residential prior to that, and then you've seen a strong upward trend, and that 2019 big year was included the what's the new Parliament building?
The ones by the old Founders Theatre.
Yeah, opposite the Founders Theatre, the big new one. Yeah, and so that was a big year. So even though you can see 2020 looks a bit less on the trend scale, it's still up. And in the second one, new construction. So that graph, the grey is alterations and addition, and the orange is new construction. So you can again see a really strong trend upwards. And that 2013 number was actually the Centre Place one. So that was just before the CBD remission. But anyway, you can see, and I've got some longer analysis about this, which will end up in a report. But my view and what I understand is that yes, it is actually a really effective use of a remission.
So much longer was it to go for?
The council decision was that it would end on the 30 June, but not end, that it would be reviewed.
Next year.
So yeah, LTP. So in this DC policy, a decision about what to do going forward.
Yeah. In terms of that, I see Sarah's got a question, so is you, and so is Max. So yes, I'm coming round. In respect to that, you've got all data from people who are planning work right now in the CBD, and how long that, do we know anything about? Because it seems like there's lots going on all over the place.
Yes.
But that's, apropos of me walking around knowing nothing about it. But I assume that there looks like a surge of construction yet to come. I understand from the Master Builders Association, etc., that they're not seeing any end to demand for, they reckon that the peak of that's all going to be about February or something like next year. A lot of projects are in the pipeline, and then, so So supposing if there was that bubble coming through early next year, there's going to be a window of construction, isn't there? So keeping this going a little bit longer might see us through the completion of quite a significant bow wave of central city development, or no?
Yes, potentially, yeah. And obviously it depends when they lodge their, or when their consents are granted. So when your consent is granted, that's when your DC is struck. So whatever time that is.
So that might be part of the, do you think that's part of it, that there's so many, because I understood from just loose conversations, and I'm not as connected to the conversations as your team will be, but that there was a lot of work likely to hit us early in the new year. Do you think that's because they see the end of the CBD remission, or is it just a natural upturn in opportunity?
I think it's quite possibly a factor, yes.
Okay.
Because they want certainty. I mean, they can have the indications that the council supports it, but that wouldn't surprise me. And I know of, I mean, I can think of, off the top of my head, 3 or 4 like significant developments that are happening, like you say, and I can think of a couple sort of off the record conversations about things that are coming. So yeah, I think there's a lot of activity. Do you have a view on that? Have you about the?
I think you've nailed it with the, they want certainty. So these large developments get a very substantial reduction in council costs through the remission. We saw this last time when the DC policy charges increased. There was a substantial increase in the number of lodgements directly prior to the charges going up. So I think that's indicative that these types of decisions really incentivise developer behaviour, and we need to think carefully before we make any massive changes, because it will materially affect these developers.
And so the question we need to be asking ourselves, perhaps as council, is it, are we there yet? You know, because we put the CBD remission in to have an effect, to deliberately drive some behaviours, as you say. Are we there yet? And when might we be there where the CBD is vibrant enough and we don't have to, because I mean it is subsidised by the wider market in a way, isn't it? Just a question on the last one for me, and then Ewan. The NPS on urban design, urban development, sorry. Do we expect that to have a significant impact on the amount of work that goes on in the CBD, given that now the height planes, etc., and you know you can build bigger apartments and closer and no car parks and etc., etc., etc. What effect will that have on it?
Stafford is our UD expert. What do you got?
So as I understand it, the rules in the CBD are already quite permissive. So, and we don't often see developers using to the full extent of the planning legislative framework that's currently in place. So I wouldn't anticipate in the near term a springing up of to the capacity that the changes that the UD brings to planning legislative framework. I wouldn't anticipate to see any change in developer behaviour, but one thing is that these change over time as development feasibility changes. So you go forward 5 years and maybe the price of land to the value of that, the proximity to being in the CBD might change, so you might see more uptake then. I think one good analogy would be to talk about something like duplex developments, where they weren't necessarily, once the rules changed, you didn't really see many duplex developments. It took people realising that the market had changed and that this was a viable development to do before there was uptake. So perhaps 1 or 2 successful developments in the CBD will change developers' behaviour and mindset on if this is something they want to get involved in. So it's kind of we're going to wait and see framework, but I think someone like Luke O'Dwyer will have a more nuanced view on the situation than that.
Thank you. Ewan?
Look, thanks, Mayor Paula. I don't believe we're quite at the stage yet where we'd want to slow encouraging infill in the CBD. But I wonder in the future how detailed and how prescriptive could we become? For example, if we wanted to have, you know, any sort of infill development in the CBD, it's a 66% reduction. But if we wanted high-rise apartments that meet certain criteria, where we try to, in some ways, it would force at a development stage the type of design and living space we would like, where we could in fact incentivise them with a zero. So rather than leaving it in the hands of a developer who may go for intensity over living quality and space, we say, well, actually, we want a 2-bathroom, we want a certain size type development, and if you do that, then we would give you a zero. Can we be that prescriptive?
You can, actually, the CBD is that you can be quite prescriptive. I won't put my team on the spot, but they have a good insight into which things you can actually differentiate between. So if you said if it's over 6 floors, you get 100% remission, it's probably pretty easy to count the number of floors. Someone will say, oh, well, the basement car park counts as a floor, and then okay. But, you know, but generally speaking, it's not too hard. Once you get into really detailed stuff, you just got to be careful that it's clear to developers that they should know what the outcome will be based on their development. So I think as part of this, and we're going to clearly spend quite a bit of focus here for the next time to come back with sort of clear options and what is in our view is likely to be more successful or less successful, and give you an ability to pick through those. But I think the short answer is, there's quite a bit of ability for the DC policy to deliver different outcomes. Particularly, the CBD is easier than perhaps.
Because I'm clearly trying to avoid an Auckland scenario where you have all of these apartments that are 45 square metres, tiny, versus quality type products that you get in the Riverview, etc. So I'm just trying to be slightly more prescriptive to ensure that while we're encouraging infill, it's of good quality and that it promotes good family living type.
I think the thing overall to remember is that the district plan, determines things such as that, and the DC policy should be looked at to encourage, into certain avenues or whatever. If you try and make the DC policy your planning document, then that I wouldn't recommend doing that. So there is a bit of needs to be a bit of thinking around there. Now I'm aware that we're at time. Sorry.
We are. We'll just take this last wrap-up of questions, which is Maxine, Sarah, and then Ryan.
And I just want to rattle through, I'll rattle through them really quick, just a couple of last slides, because I think I want to make sure. But I will go quickly.
That's okay. It's an important topic. Maxine first.
Look, just with regard to in the city and density, I do support that, and a reduction in the DCs. You talk about the real cost to the city in that, and but you don't explain where any of that is. I guess if we've got more people coming in, we're going to need more infrastructure around cycling, pedestrians. We'll need inner city parks and spaces for them to use. How might that be considered in future DC remissions? And how can we plan for that if it's not going to be in the next 10 or so years?
Sure. What I meant by real cost to the city actually is real cost to the developer / ratepayer. If you, for every dollar that you remit of DCs, in effect the ratepayer pays. So that's the trade-off that we're talking about here across all of these ideas. In regards to your question about cycleways and other inner city infrastructure, so you can start recovering development contributions for infrastructure that is funded in your 10-year plan, so it could be a number of years away, as well as infrastructure that's already in that hasn't been paid off by DCs. So again, that's a choice, but the option's available for you to basically include those things in your DC. But if you include them in your DC and then remit them, then effectively your ratepayer funding your cycleways. So there's a bit of a dance. I mean, the short answer is that it's either developer funded or ratepayer funded, and to the extent to which you want to determine what that balance should be, and whether it's more important for a vibrant CBD or whether just a pure rates question. And that's what the elected members decide. Does that answer your questions, or have I?
Yeah, it does. I think though it's something that we have to consider really carefully, because if we want to have a filled up CBD, we need to be able to provide amenities for them as well, so it's an enjoyable living and not just living in a box with a bathroom.
Maxine, and that's part of the feedback that I think staff are looking for from us today. How do we pitch that level? Sarah, then Ryan, then we'll go through the last few slides, and then we'll have a once round to see what everybody's feeling. Okay, and then we'll have to move on. Is that okay?
Cool, thank you.
Sarah.
Just on the tail of Ewan's question around being specific, I wondered also, we have a lack of universally accessible homes in the city, and I think a lot of the time people with mobility issues like to be close to things, so in city centre or at a transport node. But I wonder if we could require, in order to get, say, the remission, that you have to have a proportion of fully accessible dwellings within your development. That could be something that we at least considered as an option.
So, can you just describe a fully accessible dwelling, please?
I know that there's LifeMark as a standard, so I imagine there's things that someone in a wheelchair or someone who's older, that kind of thing, is able to live in the house. So it might have slightly wider door frames, or something like the bathroom might be need to be slightly larger, that kind of thing. So, I don't know all of the details around what LifeMark requires. I don't think it's substantial, the changes, but it does require a slightly different design and maybe a tiny bit more space.
Right. So you couldn't ask the DC team to determine whether or not houses are accessible. I think that's probably outside of what they could achieve. I think that's too difficult. But the way that you would do it, and my suggestion would be that you have a certain accreditation. So you say, if a dwelling is X accredited, then it is then it receives Y remission or whatever. It would be the way to do it. So often with these things, it's about defining the thing and making the definition clear, or that there's a certification, something that you say, please forward your LifeMark certification, and then that gets you the thing. So that would be probably the way to do it. Yeah.
Yeah, I imagine you'd use something like LifeMark as your accreditation. Okay, and the other thing was just I watched the recording of the last briefing, so some discussion around social housing. What I wouldn't be keen really to see remission with a kind order. There are community housing developers and they would be linked eventually with the Lands Trust. So I would be keen to see what we could do in that space. So I guess it would be good for this to kind of be linked to that housing strategy conversation.
We will take that away. In fact, we got a social housing remission quite progressed at an earlier policy, and then it was not chosen to go ahead. Stafford has talked to the team and community, and we've got some back work, so I think we'll just take that away as something to bring back as an option.
Yeah, cool, thank you.
So, Ryan.
Greg, just picking up on Ewan's comments around, you mentioned that the operative district plan isn't really a planning document, but within the frameworks of the infill, we can guide quite more nimbly some of that infill and that sort of stuff. Could we layer it, for example, have we've got 2/3 or full remission in the CBD, and then a third remission in, say, Frankton, so you sort of start to guide this generic infill across the city and channel it through sort of a layered approach?
I mean, the council can choose to provide remissions anywhere that it can, satisfactorily define. So if you have if we can define Frankton or a zone in Frankton that you want to do, I mean, absolutely. I think it's for us, for staff, it's about helping understand, what the pros and cons and other things we know about, housing preferences and how those would be relevant. But ultimately, it's just a decision for the council. If that's the path, then you can do it. The actual doing of it is not a problem.
So yes, in other words, and we could.
No, that was a no.
and we could create a layered sort of inducement by default within the operating district.
You can. I mean, one complaint you'll always hear from the developers is that the DC policy is too complex, and so if you introduce something with layers of complexity, that will further that'll make that argument more accurate. So,
you could have layers of simplicity, depending on how you phrase it, eh?
Yeah, I mean,
Yes.
there's a balance in all these things. The short answer is obviously yes, you can, and then you need some thought about the wider implications. I think. Yeah.
Thanks.
Being a man of such few words, but on point when you use them, I think you should have a role there. But no, I'm just joking, because I do actually think that that ability to talk with the community about the why and wherefore is incredibly important outside of the complexity. And you're right, we need to be able to say we do this because, and that's it. So sometimes few words are better than many in that point. That was a compliment.
Thanks.
It was. All right, last few slides.
Yes, so if we can just go to slide 15. That one, so Mayor Paula, this was, you addressed this earlier, but just to quick show that this is in the, that we'll be coming back about this, so just to let you know that we were thinking about it. Next slide.
Just on that, one question. Can we differentiate, when you're thinking about it and coming back to us with some views, can we differentiate between, because I think there's a certain level of basic expectation for people, like basic level of service, water, roads, somewhere to put, rubbish collection, all of those things that are basic, and every ratepayer assumes they're going to get that basic level of service. That's what they pay the rates for. And then there's the, I don't want to say cream on the top, but sometimes it is. Sometimes it's lifting the bar, and then sometimes there's even more than that. It's putting the cream on the top. And that's the area that I'm interested in exploring when people want to push up there. We've got the budget for giving everyone equity. Does this make sense to anybody else? Equity across the services we provide, and they want something more. And that's fine. And some people are able to meet the cost of the something more.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense.
Because otherwise we start to treat parts of our city unequally, and I could go on about Enderley with, because I've been talking with Mark about it. But you know what I mean? It starts to become, older areas of the city start to be less invested in, and, that's not right either. So.
That's good. Next one. So I just had here the outstanding issues from the previous review from the developers. Now, when we go into a PX briefing, so you can understand the parameters of the judicial review. This is just sort of a visibility of the prior ones, and I can easily bring this back up. I just wanted to just highlight that those were the key issues that at the end of when the policy was adopted, the developers and I think actually Mayor Paula, it was you that said at that meeting, I just detail what are the outstanding issues and we will look to address them in this policy review. So that's what I'm doing here, is just saying, okay, those are the issues the key issues that they raised, and and they're in the pipeline to deal with. Obviously now we've got a new, sort of a new curveball here which will weave into this, but this just for visibility really.
Site credits, was that covered in part in refunds on subdivision estimates?
Yes, that's covered in that.
In early consultation, developer review group, covered this off earlier with Councillor Margaret's question, and we'll be coming back to you further with that.
That gross floor, I don't want to spend a lot of time on it, but can we get some understanding of the impact on what I think you were talking about earlier about the quality? It's not about building 3 boxes in a building with 1 toilet and a boxy little kitchen. It's actually about creating.
Yes, that is actually about what is a square metre of gross floor area, and in particular, should a canopy be gross floor area or not, or what sort of canopies, and that's that issue. But then your question around like quality housing in terms of, you know, appropriate size and stuff, yeah, that's the other question that we'll come back to you on.
And you can do small, but it can be well designed, so that's another point. But yeah, not allowing developers just to make the smallest unit they can, to put as many units as they can, which actually don't become very nice living arrangements for anyone in the long term. I'm not going to use the slum word, but you know, that's what some people will see some of this development as. I know.
Yeah, and I'll be
been
working through
cheeky.
that with the team to get a better understanding of how we can differentiate those things. And that is all.
Perfect. Thank you.
Cool, thank you.
So we've got a community one next that I'm going to chair.
Yeah, that's great.
But should we take a 5-minute
Yes,
break?
please, because I've left my phone in the car.
Yeah. Martin, was your question about that?
Well, no, just the observation that, and it relates to the development contribution, that if you get permission to build units, flats, whatever, and then you suddenly decide to just turn it into a bed, you know, what am I saying here? Tick off units, and then suddenly you turn it into what you're not being given permission for. I just want to ensure that we have adequate resourcing for inspection and enforcement. And I've certainly got an example near my Broad neighbourhood where the rubbish is out every week, and I'd be really fascinated to see what the permit was in the first place. Do you see what I mean? Versus units, versus an oven in every room. And this is the really important thing, is that we rigorously, without fear or favour, enforce what I'm probably not expressing myself very well, but I think you know what I'm getting at.
So once again, this is one of those issues that the DC policy leverages off other areas in council. So we best align with district plan regulations, and the DCs are charged on consents. So we have a building consent or a resource consent that triggers the assessment for development contributions. So once again, the enforcement of these planning issues, it comes back to the district plan and not a development contribution sense. If through this enforcement action they need to be consented, or either they revert back to what they should be under their current consent, or if they need a new consent, the new consent would trigger a DC assessment. So while DCs don't have a hand to play in enforcement, if there's any enforcement action that triggers assessments, the assessments do come back to the team and they will pay whatever under the current DC policy they require to pay.
So what I want, when we do our LTP, I want a very specific topic on the resourcing of inspection and monitoring of consents and upholding of consents, and severe penalties if people blatantly blatantly move away from what they're being consented to. So that's an issue of resourcing, but it's what I'm trying to say here. This is all part of the integrated whole. Put it that way.
Okay, I'll pass those on to the planning team for you.
So if we take a 5-minute break and come back, what, 5 to 11, does it suit people? Is it enough for a cup of tea for people?
I think make it 10. I've got to go and get keys.
10, okay, we'll make it 11 o'clock.
Bed people back in it.
Okay, it'll just be a tight session because I want to make sure we don't drag over lunch. 11 o'clock, guys, does that suit you in Zoomland? 11 o'clock?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.